The chair was small, not insultingly small, not small the way a child's chair is small. Small the way everything given to humans in the conclave of galactic powers was small. Just enough to function, not enough to matter. The kind of small that said, "You are here because we allow it, not because you belong." Delegate Mara Voss sat in it anyway. She sat straight, hands folded on the low desk in front of her, which was also small, and set 3 tiers below the main floor of the chamber, where the real delegates sat with their real desks, and their real water carafes, and their real sense of permanent importance. The conclave chamber was built like a theater, concentric rings of curved benches descending toward a central speaking floor, each ring representing rank. The Varric Dominion sat at the top naturally, 14 seats, deep red sashes, their ambassador a creature called Vorak Tan, who was 7 feet tall, and had not looked at Mara once since the session opened. The Solen Collective sat 1 tier below, their 3 delegates moving in that slow, synchronized way they always moved, like 3 fingers of the same hand. The Preth Assembly occupied an entire ring to themselves despite only fielding 2 representatives, old ones, the kind of old that preceded written language, their gray skin like folded paper, their eyes like something that had already seen everything and found it mildly disappointing. Then came the smaller powers, the Charon clans, the Madrith trade guilds, several species Mara had never managed to correctly identify. Then, at the very bottom tier, practically on the floor itself, Mara Voss, human Earth, 1 delegate, 1 desk, 1 chair that was slightly too small. She had been sitting in this chair, or chairs like it, for 11 years. She had learned to sit in a way that made her look comfortable in it. This was not a small skill. The session had been running for 4 hours. Most of it was, as usual, not about Earth at all. Trade negotiations between the Solen Collective and the Charon clans. A territorial boundary dispute near the Preth Assembly's 3rd research system. A vote on standardized fuel taxation across jump lanes which passed, and which would cost human freighters an additional 12% per transit. A fact that was mentioned exactly once, and met with no discussion. Mara wrote it down. She wrote everything down. She had 6 small notebooks filled with things like this. Things that happened at the bottom of the chamber, while everyone else was looking elsewhere. Vorak Tan finally spoke about Earth at the 3-hour mark. He didn't stand. He didn't look at Mara. He addressed the chamber the way a person addresses a room about a leaking pipe. Technically necessary, faintly irritating. Nothing personal. The matter of Earth's colony status, he said. His translator rendered his voice into something flat and slightly nasal in the chamber's shared feed, specifically the 3 outer settlements, Kepler 7 Station, the Brennan Habitats, and the Mira Agricultural Ring. As agreed in the 42nd session, these were designated as development assets under provisional Varric administrative oversight pending Earth's formal reclassification. Mara kept her hands folded. The Assembly has reviewed Earth's petition for reinstatement of independent colony status. Vorak Tan continued. The petition was found to be insufficient. Earth's fleet capability does not meet the minimum threshold for independent colony protection. Earth's economic output in the outer systems does not meet the minimum threshold for self-sustaining operation. He paused. Just briefly. Just long enough. The Varric Dominion recommends formal reclassification of Earth as a protected primitive world, Category 3. This would render the petition moot and place all outer Earth settlements under permanent Dominion oversight. The chamber did not erupt. There was no dramatic reaction. That was the thing about the conclave. Decisions like this were not dramatic. They were administrative. A Category 3 reclassification was paperwork. It would be filed, indexed, and referenced in future sessions the same way a road tax was referenced. Mara's people, the ones living on Kepler 7 and in the Brennan Habitats and tending the crops on the Mira Ring, would simply continue to exist under a different heading. One of the Preth scholars glanced down at Mara. Just glanced, like checking whether a piece of furniture had moved. Then looked away. Vorak Tan finally looked at her. The delegate from Earth may respond if she wishes, he said, within the standard 3-minute allowance. Mara stood. She walked to the speaking floor. Her footsteps on the descending steps were the only sound for a moment. Small, even steps, no hurry. She reached the center floor. Looked up at the rings of delegates above her. At their various faces and non-faces and sensory organs pointed in her direction. She said, "I want to thank the Assembly for the time and consideration given to Earth's petition." She paused. "I understand the position." A Charon delegate made a sound that wasn't quite laughter. Almost. "Earth withdraws its petition," Mara said. "We accept the terms of Category 3 reclassification." There was a brief murmur, a few exchanges of data notes between delegates. The Preth scholars did not move at all. Vorak Tan nodded. Something in the angle of his neck communicated satisfaction. "Then the motion is." "However," Mara said. Vorak Tan stopped. "I would like to submit a formal record of acknowledgement," she continued, "in the Conclave's permanent registry. A simple statement of fact for the historical record. She reached into the folder she had carried with her and placed a single paper on the speaking floor's lectern. Not a data file, actual paper. She had printed it that morning. Earth accepts these terms. We understand our place in the current order. We accept the Dominion's oversight. We accept the reclassification. She looked up at the chamber. Her face was composed. Her voice was even. We simply want it noted formally that we asked, and that we were refused, and that we sat at this table for 11 years and asked every time and were refused every time. A pause. Very short. That's all. She picked up the document. Vorik Tan's aide had already transmitted the official version to her personal reader, and signed it with a pen, on paper, slowly enough that it was visible to the chamber. Vorik Tan said something to his aide in a low voice. The aide made a sound of subdued amusement. Earth's footnote will be added to the registry, said the session moderator, an automated voice, perfectly neutral. Mara nodded. She walked back up the steps. She sat down in her small chair. She placed the signed document back in her folder. She placed the folder flat on the small desk. She folded her hands on top of it. The galaxy's footnote, said Vorik Tan, not into the chamber's address system. Just to his aide, in a murmur, but the session's open audio captured it, translated it, delivered it to every earpiece in the room, to Mara's reader. She read it, looked at the words on her screen. She looked up at Vorik Tan. He wasn't looking at her. He had already moved on to the next item. She said it quietly, not even into the room's pickup, just to herself, or almost to herself. Just loud enough for the one Preth scholar who was still, for some reason, watching her. We've been called worse. The Preth scholar looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his ancient folded face. Not quite an expression. The suggestion of one. Then he looked away. The session ended 40 minutes later. Trade updates. Fuel tax implementation schedule. A brief announcement about the closure of a disputed lane near the Madreth systems. Mara gathered her things. Nodded to the few delegates who passed near her tier. None nodded back, but some registered her presence, which was more than she usually got. She walked out through the lower exit, the one human delegates always used, the one that came out near the maintenance corridors rather than the central atrium. She walked to her office, small office, lower floor, window facing the gray side of the station instead of the atrium gardens. She sat down. She poured water from a plain container, drank it slowly. Outside, through the gray window, she could see a sliver of space, stars, black distance. The station's maintenance arms extending out into nothing. She opened her reader. Found the message address she had kept in memory for 11 years, updated every 6 months as protocols shifted. She opened a new encrypted message. She thought for a moment. She typed 2 words. She stared at them. She pressed send. Then she sat back and looked at the stars. And for the first time in 11 years, she did not make a list of anything. She did not write in her notebook. She did not review session recordings or prepare responses to pending motions. She just sat. Somewhere several hundred light years away, or much closer than anyone would have guessed, in places that were not on any chart, the message arrived. 2 words. Begin transit. And in the dark, in the silence between stars, in the void behind gas giants and inside the shadows of dead systems, and deep within the electromagnetic noise of places no galactic survey had ever bothered to properly map, things that had been still for a very long time began, very slowly to move. The stars outside Mara's window did not change. The maintenance arms extended and retracted. The station hummed with its own familiar rhythm. Nothing looked different. That was the point. That had always been the point. Mara finished her water, rinsed the glass, set it on the shelf above her desk where it always sat. She thought about Kepler 7 station, about the people living there now under Dominion oversight, doing whatever the Dominion required of them, sending their data to Varric administrators instead of to Earth. She thought about the Brennan habitats, about the Mira agricultural ring, good soil, her briefing said, rich output, the Dominion would use it well. She thought about Vorik Tan's voice. The galaxy's footnote. She picked up her notebook, the 6th one, almost full. She wrote the date. Then she wrote, 11 years, 4 months, 17 days. I signed the document today. She paused. Then she wrote, they have no idea. She closed the notebook. She turned off her desk lamp. She went to bed. Outside, the station turned slowly in space, its lights dotting the hull, its gardens lit behind glass, its 17 tiers of importance arranged just so. The Varric Dominion's diplomatic shuttle was still docked in the upper port. The Preth Assembly's ancient transport sat in its berth, older than the station itself by about 2 centuries. One small human shuttle sat in the lowest berth. Practical design. No weapons worth mentioning. Registry numbers updated yearly, always on time, never a problem. The stars held still, for now. In a meeting room 3 levels above Mara's office, Vorik Tan was hosting a small dinner for his senior diplomatic staff. The food was excellent. The conversation was light. The session had gone smoothly. The reclassification had passed without incident. The human delegate had been, as always, no real problem. Someone made a joke. Mara hadn't heard it, but she could have guessed its shape. They laughed, poured more of whatever they were drinking. The session recorder clicked off. Another day in the conclave. Another item filed and finished. Vorik Tan looked out his window, the upper window, the one facing the atrium gardens, the one with the full view of open space beyond, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing cleanly concluded. He had no reason to look at the stars with any special attention. He did not look at the stars with any special attention. He poured his drink, turned to his aide, said something about tomorrow's schedule, and in the dark, far from everything, in directions that didn't appear on any registered chart, 17 things that should not have existed moved through space without sound, without signal, without light, patient, as they had always been, as they had been trained to be, as their parents and grandparents and the silent, nameless generations before them had built them to be. They moved, and the galaxy, warm and self-assured and deeply unaware, went on with its evening. The name of the project was never written down anywhere that could be found. Not because they were careless about naming it, because they had decided, in the very first meetings 200 years ago, that a named thing was a known thing, and a known thing could be found, and a found thing could be stopped. So it had no name. The people who worked on it called it, in the way that workers always develop informal language for large abstract things, simply the program. Sometimes the work, sometimes, in the dark humor that develops in people who spend years doing something they cannot talk about, the hobby. It was not a hobby. 206 years before Mara Voss signed anything, a man named Tobias Crane took a job he was not permitted to describe. He was 31, an engineer, good with welding rigs and hull stress calculations, excellent at working in vacuum conditions without losing focus, and above average at keeping his mouth closed about things that weren't his business. These qualities were not accidental in his selection. He kissed his wife. He hugged his daughter, who was 4 years old and smelled like the cheap soap they used at the daycare she attended on Tuesdays. He told them he was going to be working cargo routes for about 8 months, maybe a bit longer. The pay was very good. He would send messages when he could. He sent messages when he could. They were short. They contained no useful information about where he was or what he was doing, because the outgoing message system was filtered, and he had signed 6 documents agreeing not to include such information. The messages contained things like, "I'm okay. It's cold here. I miss you both. How is the daycare?" His daughter grew up thinking her father worked cargo. He worked in a shipyard. The shipyard was behind Saturn. Not in orbit around Saturn. Behind it, tucked into the permanent shadow of the gas giant's night side at a distance that put it outside the range of any commercially operated sensor network. The shipyard was not one structure. It was 17 structures, spread across a zone of space about the size of a small moon, connected by transit tubes and sealed corridors and the kind of zero communication, operational protocols that made the whole complex feel, some days, like a very large monastery. Tobias Crane welded hull plating. The hull plating was for ships, very large ships. Ships of a class that had no existing designation in any fleet registry, because ships of this class had never existed before. The design team, which Tobias never met, which operated in a separate structure 300 kilometers away, had apparently spent 40 years on the hull geometry alone, running simulations against every weapons system currently deployed by every major galactic power. The hull plating Tobias welded was the result of 40 years of those simulations. It was very good hull plating. He welded it for 6 years. In 6 years, he completed his section of one ship's forward port quarter. When he left, transferred out, sent home with a pension and a new set of documents to sign, he had no idea how large the ship was. He had only ever seen his section. The shipyard was built that way on purpose. No single worker saw the whole thing. No single worker could go home and, even accidentally, describe the whole thing. He went home. His daughter was 10. She barely remembered him at first, and then slowly, over weeks, she did. And they became the kind of father and daughter who were quietly awkward and quietly loving in equal measure. He never told her. He thought about it sometimes, particularly in the last years of his life, when he was old and the arthritis made his hands ache and the news carried stories about the Vorik Dominion's latest territorial expansion. Another colony system absorbed, another species reclassified, the Galactic Order doing what the Galactic Order did. He thought about his section of the ship, about whether it was finished, about what it looked like, the whole thing, when it was done. He died without knowing. He would have been satisfied to know. What he had welded was part of the forward port quarter of a ship called, internally, by the people who completed it, Hull 1. Hull 1 was 12 kilometers long. It was the smallest ship in what would eventually be called Fleet 1. Fleet 1 was the smallest of the 17 fleets. 104 years before Mara Voss sent her message. A woman named Admiral Constance Adeyemi received a commission that did not exist. The commission was delivered by hand, by a civilian who arrived at her apartment at 6 in the morning and left after 7 minutes, and it was printed on paper that had been treated to dissolve in water within 48 hours of exposure to air. She read it standing in her kitchen in her uniform, because she had already been awake for 2 hours, and had already suspected this morning was coming. The commission gave her command of the 17th Fleet. She had never heard of the 17th Fleet. She reported to a transit hub in Nairobi, took a series of connecting flights that involved no commercial carriers, and arrived, 39 hours later, at a facility inside an asteroid that was cataloged in public records as an automated mining operation. The facility was not an automated mining operation. It was a command school. Kind of command school, where the curriculum included things like how to fight a war when the enemy does not know you exist, and how to win a battle when you are not permitted to be seen losing one, and how to keep 10,000 people operational, cohesive, and mentally intact while those 10,000 people live their entire careers without being able to tell their families what they do. She spent 3 years at the school. Then she took command of the 17th Fleet, which she finally saw for the first time on the day she boarded her flagship. She stood on the bridge, looked out the forward viewports. The fleet was arrayed in space around her, hundreds of ships, each one larger than anything in Earth's public naval registry. Each one carrying weapons systems that, according to the public record, did not exist. Each one crewed by people who had signed the same documents she had signed, whose families thought they worked cargo routes or research stations or long-haul transit positions. How long has the fleet been assembled? She asked her executive officer. This configuration, about 11 years, Admiral. Some of the older hulls go back 60. She looked at the ships, hundreds of them still in the dark, engines cold, running on minimal power, no signals going out, and no one knows. No one outside the program. Admiral, no. She thought about that for a while. How many people know inside the program? Current count is approximately 340,000. Across all 17 fleets, shipyards, and support facilities. 340,000 people keeping a secret. She had not thought it was possible to keep a secret at that scale. She revised her understanding of what was possible. And the fleets before mine. Who commanded them? 1st through 16th Fleet commands are on rotation. We rotate command staff every 8 years to maintain operational freshness. You replace Admiral Huang. She's being transferred to logistics oversight. I'd like to meet her. She'll be at your briefing tomorrow, Admiral. Constance Adeyemi spent 22 years in command of the 17th Fleet. Under her command, the fleet's training doctrine shifted significantly. She introduced what became known internally as the Adeyemi Principle, which was not about weapons or tactics or formation geometry, but about one specific question she required every officer under her command to be able to answer. What happens the day after we win? Not in the abstract, in specific detail. What happens to the crews of the ships you disable? What happens to the populations of the systems you secure? What happens to the political structures you displace? What are the costs? What are the responsibilities? What does a victory that creates a 30-year insurgency actually cost, compared to a slower, messier resolution that creates stability? She was not gentle about it. She required her officers to study every major interstellar conflict in galactic history for the past 3 centuries, to analyze not just the battles but the aftermaths, to calculate, as precisely as the data allowed, the difference between winning a war and winning what came after. Her officers hated the classes. They were engineers and pilots and weapons specialists. They wanted to talk about thrust ratios and firing solutions. She made them read history. The galaxy has been fighting wars since before Earth had writing, she told a class of junior officers about 6 years into her command. A room full of young faces, serious, bright, used to being the best in whatever previous posting they'd come from. Every one of those wars was won by someone. Can any of you name a single galactic power that won a war and then remained at peace for more than 50 years? Silence. The Preth Assembly. Someone offered tentative. The Preth Assembly hasn't fought a war in 800 years, Adeyemi said. They also haven't fought a war in 800 years because they made their neighbors afraid of them. Not allies. Afraid. Do you know what afraid neighbors do? Overtimes. They plan, she said. Constantly. They never stop. And one day the math changes and the afraid neighbors are afraid no longer, and then there is another war. She looked around the room. We will not do this. When we act, if we ever act, we will act in such a way that the day after is already planned, the week after, the year after. We will not leave a wound that festers. We will not win a battle and lose the century. She paused. We have been building for 200 years. We will not waste it on a victory that eats itself. The class graduated. The officers went to their posts. Some of them talked about that lecture for the rest of their careers. Constance Adeyemi retired. She never saw the program activated. Her son became a fleet officer. Her grandson became an admiral. 3 weeks before Mara Voss sent her message, Admiral Yusuf Adeyemi III stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the full display for the first time in his career. Not the operational display, the one that showed his own fleet's positions. The full display, all 17. The fleet intelligence system mapped them in holographic projection above the command table. Blue markers, each one a ship. The display took 3 minutes to fully render. There were a lot of blue markers. His executive officer, Commander Lena Park, watched the display finish rendering and then stood quietly for about 30 seconds. Well, she said. Yes, said Adeyemi. I knew it was large. She said, they told us in briefings. I thought I understood the scale. You didn't, he said. No, she agreed. I didn't. The display showed 17 fleet groupings distributed across the outer systems, tucked into dead star systems, sheltered behind gas giants, running cold inside asteroid fields, sitting in zones of electromagnetic interference that made them invisible to standard long-range sensors. The ships were not identical. 200 years of continuous development had produced generation after generation of hull designs, each one incorporating lessons from the previous, each one tested in deep space exercises in zones so remote that the light from those exercises would not reach inhabited space for centuries. The oldest hulls were still operational. They had been continuously upgraded. Some of them had been rebuilt so many times that nothing original remained. Ship of Theseus, hull by hull, system by system, until what remained was the intent of the original and nothing else. Run the readiness report, Adeyemi said. The report ran. It took 4 minutes to compile. Fleet readiness was displayed as a percentage. He looked at the number. He had expected something in the high 80s, 90 maybe, if they'd had a good operational year. The number was 97.3. That can't be right, Park said. It's right, said his chief engineer, Lieutenant Commander Rao, who had run the readiness systems for 6 years and had a tone of voice that suggested she found doubt mildly offensive. We had a very good year. Adeyemi looked at the display. 97.3% readiness across 17 fleets. Across, he checked the count. 41,612 ships. He thought about his grandmother, about the classes she had taught, about the questions she had required her officers to answer. What happens the day after we win? He knew the answer. He had spent his entire career learning it, refining it, building the doctrine that answered it as precisely as he could make it. Adeyemi doctrine, they called it now, his version, named after the family, not just him. 3 generations of the same question. 3 generations of sharpening the answer. The answer was, the day after we win, we do not occupy, we do not administer, we offer terms, specific, humane, pragmatic terms. We leave functional governments in place where they exist. We enable trade where it benefits both parties. We enforce exactly one rule, with absolute consistency. You do not harm our people, and we will not harm yours. That was the doctrine. He looked at 97.3% readiness, 41,000 ships in the dark, 380,000 crew, give or take, living their compressed secret lives, 200 years of work. He thought of Tobias Crane, though he didn't know the name. He thought of the generation of Cranes, engineers and welders and systems specialists who had spent their careers building something they could not see the whole of, for a purpose they would not live to witness. He thought of his grandmother. He thought of Mara Voss, sitting in her small chair, in her small office in the station where she had spent 11 years being ignored. His personal comm chimed. He looked at the message. 2 words. He was still for a moment, long enough that Park looked at him. Admiral. He straightened, adjusted the front of his uniform, set his shoulders. All fleets, he said, transit to Galactic Core. Formation Omega. Park looked at the display, looked at all those blue markers. She had run simulations. She had studied the doctrine. She had believed in this for years in the abstract way that people believe in things they have not yet seen. The blue markers began to move, not fast, not the way attack orders move, urgent, scrambled, immediate. They moved the way the tide moves, the way a glacier moves when you know enough to watch the right time frame. They moved as if they had been about to move for a long time, which they had. 200 years is a long time to get ready. The first sign was wrong numbers, not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that triggers alerts and wakes up admirals, just numbers that didn't quite fit the models. Gravitational variance readings in 3 outer systems that were slightly off from projected. Base lines, the kind of thing that sensor operators are attributed to calibration drift and logged as a maintenance note, and did not think about further. The second sign was also wrong numbers, but in more places. The third sign was a sensor ghost. Fleet Commander Sketh Ra of the Varric Dominion encountered the ghost on day 11, when his border patrol fleet was running a standard sweep of the outer Kareth systems, a quiet route. Patrolled by rotation, never interesting. His sensor officer flagged a reading at the edge of the long-range array. A mass signature, very large, gone in seconds. Calibrate the array, Skeffra said. Already calibrated this morning, Commander. Run it again. It ran again. Nothing on the display. Clean space. The outer Kareth systems were dead systems. No habitable worlds, no commercially viable resources, no reason for anyone to be there. The ghost had probably been debris drift or a sensor artifact or any of the dozen boring explanations that sensor ghosts usually had. Sketh-Ra noted it in his log and moved on. On day 14, 3 different Varric patrol commanders filed mass signature anomaly reports within 6 hours of each other. Different systems, different sectors, all in the outer reaches, all briefly there, then gone. The anomaly reports went up the chain. They reached Sketh-Ra's desk because he was the senior commander in the border region. He read them in sequence. He sat with them for a while. The systems in the reports were not adjacent. They did not form any obvious pattern at first look. He pulled a star map and plotted them. He looked at the plot for a long time. They were not adjacent, but they were equidistant. Specifically, they were equidistant from the galactic core, arranged, if you connected them, in an arc, the beginning of a circle, a very large circle. He told himself this was probably coincidence. In a galaxy with enough data points, patterns appeared in noise. This was a known problem in sensor analysis. He had taught a course on it once at the Varric Officer Academy. He noted it, filed it, sent a recommendation that the outer arrays undergo full diagnostic review. He did not sleep well that night. On day 17, the number of anomaly reports doubled. On day 19, they doubled again. On day 20, a junior sensor operator on a Varric listening post in the Druth system did something that was slightly outside his normal duties but within his technical authorization. He cross-referenced the anomaly reports from the past 3 weeks with the gravitational variance readings that had been logged as calibration drift in the first week, and he ran a composite analysis. He was 23 years old. He had been at the posting for 8 months. He was considered thorough, which was a quality his superiors found mildly inconvenient. He looked at the composite analysis for a long time. Then he sent it up the chain with a flag on it that he had never used before. The flag that meant urgent senior review required. Cannot specify further in this channel. It reached Sketh-Ra's desk at 3 in the morning, station time. Sketh-Ra read it. He read it again. He pulled the raw data and ran the analysis himself, using a different method to check. He got the same result. The gravitational variance wasn't calibration drift. It was mass displacement. The gravitational wake left by very large objects moving through space. The readings, mapped across the 3 weeks of accumulated reports, showed not random noise, not coincidence. They showed vectors. Directions of travel, convergent paths. Everything was moving toward the galactic core. He pulled the Preth Assembly's long-range data next. The Preth ran the oldest and most sophisticated sensor network in the known galaxy, a system of arrays built across 4,000 years of continuous operation, capable of reading mass signatures at distances that Varric technology couldn't approach. He had liaison credentials. He used them. He submitted an emergency data request. The Preth responded in 40 minutes, which was unusual. They typically took days. The data package they sent was flagged at the highest sensitivity level. He opened it. He looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time. The Preth data resolved the sensor ghosts into something clear and specific. Not fragments, not drifting debris, ships. Individual ship mass signatures, coherent and consistent, moving on coordinated vectors. The Preth system had identified the signatures by mass class. It could not identify hull type or armament at this range, but it could tell the difference between a patrol vessel, a destroyer, a cruiser, a capital ship, and something for which it had to create a new classification category. Because nothing in the existing registry was large enough, the new category was labeled, in the Preth's coldly neutral data language, classification unknown, mass exceeds current registry maximum. There were many entries in the new category, and they were arranged, in the Preth display, in a pattern that Sketh-Ra recognized immediately, not because he had seen it before, because he had studied military doctrine his entire career, and there was only one thing a convergent encirclement, pattern with no weapons active signatures could mean. Not attack formation, not invasion formation, containment formation. Every major system in known galactic space, every key trade hub, every military installation of significance, being surrounded quietly, geometrically, without a single active weapon signature or comm transmission, from the outside in. Like a hand closing, slowly, around a very fragile object it did not intend to crush. The question was what it intended. Sketh-Ra sat in his command chair. He had fought 30 wars. He had commanded fleets. He had ordered attacks on 6 separate species in the course of his career, and had won every engagement he was ordered to win, which was all of them. He had a record that was, by Varric standards, exemplary. He was 57 years old and had been in military service since he was 16 and had never in his life encountered a problem he could not categorize. He was having trouble categorizing this. He looked at the sensor data again. He looked at the signature counts. He looked at the mass classifications. He thought about the Varrock Dominion's entire military force, every fleet, every outpost, every ship currently operational. He had the numbers memorized because that was the kind of officer he was. He compared them to what the Preth data was showing him. His species did not have a common expression for the specific feeling of realizing that an assumption you have held your entire life was wrong. They didn't need one. The feeling had not, in Varrock history, come up very often. They were not a species that was often surprised by power. He found a chair and sat down. He had been standing. He sat down. "Commander?" said his bridge officer. Skethra never sat down on the bridge. It was simply not something he did. "Get me the border command frequency," Skethra said. "All ships, emergency channel." "Yes, Commander." "Should I flag it as?" "Flag it as whatever level is above the highest level," he said. There was a brief pause. "That would be Dominion Supreme Alert, sir. That's only ever been used twice in. Use it." On the Conclave station, alarms started at different times in different departments, depending on which systems received the Preth data feed first. The Preth Assembly's own 2 delegates received it first. They sat in their private quarters, the 2 ancient scholars who had been coming to conclave sessions for longer than most species had been members, and they reviewed the data feed in silence. They did not speak to each other immediately. They rarely needed to. Then one of them, the one who had glanced at Mara Voss after the vote, the one whose face had moved in that way that wasn't quite an expression, sent a single message, not to the station's emergency system, not to the Varrock delegates, not to the conclave administration. To Mara Voss's personal reader, the message said, "We would appreciate a private conversation at your earliest convenience." Mara read the message and set her reader down and picked up the cup of tea she had been preparing and sat at her small desk. The station's general alert system had just begun to sound, a low cyclic tone that meant elevated sensor activity, not quite an emergency. The kind of alarm that meant something was happening, but nobody was sure what. She could hear, through the wall, the corridor beyond her office filling with movement, footsteps going fast, voices in Varrock and Selen, in the several languages of the Charon clans. The normal background rhythm of the station, measured, purposeful, unhurried, replaced by something that had a different texture, controlled alarm. The sound of people who were trying to stay professional while their understanding of a situation changed under them. She drank her tea. Her door opened without a knock. Preth scholars did not knock. They had never seemed to fully accept the concept. The one who had sent the message stood in the doorway. Behind him, the corridor was moving. Screens visible through other open doors, all of them showing variations of the same data. "Delegate Voss," he said. His voice was old, very old. The way a cliff is old, present and permanent. The sensor data from the outer arrays. "Yes," she said. "These are human ships." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were pale and steady. "You have been sitting in that chair for 11 years, he said. "Signing documents." "Yes." "And the entire time?" "Yes." He was silent for a moment. She thought of a word she had read once, a specific kind of silence that is the product of a mind reformatting itself around a new truth. Not shock, something more dignified. The Preth scholar's face was doing again, that thing that wasn't quite an expression. "We have questions," he said. "I imagine you do. When can you?" The alert in the corridor shifted in pitch. A harder tone now. The tone the station used for actual incoming fleet signatures, not anomaly reports. They were here, not approaching, not en route. Here. Mara set down her cup. She looked at the Preth scholar. He was watching her with that ancient recalibrating gaze. She was aware, for the first time in 11 years, that the weight she had been carrying in her chest, the held breath, the long patience, the thing she had pressed down and pressed down and pressed down, was not there anymore. It had simply stopped. She felt lighter than she had expected. A Selen delegate appeared in the corridor behind the Preth scholar, moving fast. 3 bodies moving as one in their collective way. "The delegate from Earth," one of them said. All 3 of them said, slightly offset. "We need to understand what is happening." More footsteps, someone shouting in Varrock, somewhere above, on a higher level, and then, on every screen in the station simultaneously, on every public display and emergency readout and diplomatic communication terminal, a single transmission arrived, open channel, every known galactic language, text only, no video, no audio, just words, clean and plain, in every script that any receiver on the station could render. It said, "To the Galactic Conclave and all member civilizations, this is Admiral Yusuf Adeyemi III commanding the combined human fleet. We are present in your space in full operational capacity. We have no active weapons. We have no hostile intent. We are requesting a formal session of the Conclave at your earliest convenience. We would like to renegotiate." The corridor outside Mara's door went very quiet, not the quiet of an empty place. The quiet of a full place that had stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped everything it was doing because it had suddenly encountered a sentence it needed to sit with for a moment. Mara stood up. She straightened her jacket. She looked at the Preth scholar, who was still in her doorway, looking at her. He said, slowly, as if testing the shape of the words, the footnote. Yes, she said. It was always yes. She picked up her folder from the desk. The one that still had, inside it, the signed reclassification document. The one that had transferred 3 of Earth's colony worlds to Varric oversight. She tucked it under her arm. Shall we go find a room that seats more than 17 species? The Preth scholar stepped aside. She walked out into the corridor. Around her, the station was reconfiguring itself in real time, the internal kind of reconfiguration, the one that happened in brains and in the space between assumed facts. She could feel it. She had been preparing for it for 11 years, and she could feel it happening now, in the faces of delegates and aides and administrative staff, who saw her walking through the corridor in the middle of an emergency alert and did not understand yet that they were looking at the person who had set it in motion. She walked toward the main chamber. Outside, in the space around the station, the first ships came into visual range on the station's exterior cameras, and the feeds were pulling to every screen that had access. She didn't watch them. She had seen the ship designs in classified briefings for years. She knew what they looked like. But the delegates who had never seen them before, the ones who were crowding around displays now, in corridors and offices and the chamber itself, were seeing for the first time the thing that had been built in the dark. They were seeing it all at once, which was, Adami had once said in a briefing, the only correct way to be introduced to an irreversible truth. The order to fire came from somewhere above Sketh Ra. That was the thing he would think about later, not the battle itself, but the source of the order. It did not come from him. He was a fleet commander. The order to engage the human fleet should have come from him, or at minimum required his authorization. Instead, it came from a Dominion High Command transmission routed directly to his fleet's weapons systems, bypassing his console entirely, arriving as a fait accompli. The engagement had been authorized. His ships were to fire. He found out about it the same way his bridge crew found out. The weapons status board lit up across his entire fleet simultaneously. 400 ships coming to combat ready in a cascade that he could feel in the deck plates as power was redistributed, as the long-dormant weapons arrays came online and the targeting systems reached out and locked. Commander, his weapons officer's voice was careful. We have a firing solution on the nearest human fleet grouping, 47 ships, 47 human ships, against 400 of his. He looked at the display. The 47 human ships had not moved. They had not changed formation. They had not gone to weapons ready, at least. Their power signature did not indicate weapons systems active. They were simply there, present and still. Has the human fleet responded to our weapons activation? He asked. No change in their status, Commander. He stood there for a moment. He was a man who had ordered attacks before. He knew the weight of the moment before an order. The way it sat in the chest, the clarity of it, the absence of doubt that a good commander was supposed to feel. He had felt it every time before. He did not feel it now. He felt something else. Something that had no name in his language, a sensation adjacent to the feeling of about to make an error of the permanent kind. The order came again. High command. Direct. Engage. He engaged. 400 Varric ships opened fire. The first volley hit the human formation in a wave. Energy weapons, mass drivers. The full offensive capacity of a Varric border fleet against any other 47 ships in the known galaxy. The first volley would have ended the engagement. The human shields held, not partially, not barely, they held completely. Clean readings on the sensor display. The energy dispersal patterns showed the volley spreading across the human ship's hull geometry and dissipating. The human ships did not even move under the impact. Their formation did not shift. Their power signatures did not spike the way a shield system under stress was supposed to spike. How is that possible? Said his tactical officer. Not a question. The tone of a statement about a thing that should not be true. Second volley, Sketh Ra said. Second volley, the same result. But now the human ships moved, not back, not away, they moved forward. Slowly, a closing maneuver, neat and precise, reducing the range between their fleet and his. They were still not showing active weapons signatures. They were closing range under fire from 400 ships, and they were not firing back. What are they doing? Someone said on the bridge. Sketh Ra was watching the display very closely now. The human ships were moving into a pattern he recognized from his tactical training. Distributed engagement formation, designed to maximize coverage of a target area, while minimizing concentration of force on any single point. It was a classic pattern. He had studied it. The Varric used a version of it. The human version was cleaner. Weapons active, his sensor officer said. The tone had changed again. There was something in it that Skethra had not heard in his officer's voice before, in 30 years of service. Human fleet weapons systems are now online. Brace 4, his tactical officer began. The human fleet fired, 400 Varric ships. 400 targets. The human fleet's fire was precise in a way that Skethra had not believed was possible at this range, at this density of engagement. Each human ship appeared to have already completed firing solutions on multiple Varric targets simultaneously, and the fire came in sequence, ship by ship down the formation, not a wave but a cascade, controlled and exact. They targeted propulsion. Only propulsion. Skethra's own ship was hit twice in the span of 8 seconds. The ship shook, not catastrophically, not the way a hull breach felt, but firmly, the way something large and purposeful had decided to move it. Every console on the bridge flickered. Engines, said his engineer. Just status. Propulsion offline. Maneuvering systems offline. We are a pause. Short and precise, adrift. Weapons. Life support, green across all systems. He stood with that for a moment. Life support green. Every system that kept his crew alive was functioning. Nothing was burning. No hull breach. No casualties. The damage reports coming in from across the fleet were the same, ship after ship. Propulsion offline, weapons offline. Life support nominal. His entire fleet, 400 ships, crippled in approximately 3 minutes of exchange, floating, helpless, intact. He pulled up the sensor display on his personal reader. The ship's main display had gone with the power redistribution. The human formation had stopped. They were not advancing. They had not closed to a range where his disabled ships would be in danger of collision. They had achieved the exact tactical result they wanted. His fleet immobile, unarmed, alive, and they had stopped. 30 seconds of silence on the bridge. The kind of silence that 30-year officers were not accustomed to. The kind that took up space. Then a voice came through his bridge speakers. Human voice, rendered in standard galactic translation, flat and clean, the way all translation systems rendered things. Without accent, without the specific weight that a voice carried in its original language. He would think about that later too. About what the voice had sounded like in its own language, whether it had been calm or whether calm was just what the translation system delivered. Fleet Commander Skethra, the voice said, your crew is unharmed, your ships are secure, you will receive food and medical assistance within the hour. A repair vessel is en route to restore minimum propulsion to your fleet within 6 hours. You will be able to transit to your nearest station under your own power. We ask only that you listen. Skethra stood in the middle of his crippled bridge and looked at nothing for a moment. He had fought 30 wars. He had been in battles that lasted 3 days. He had lost ships. He had given orders that he knew would kill members of his crew, because that was the nature of the thing. He had never in 30 years been defeated. He had never been captured. He had never been on the receiving end of a battle that ended with the other side sending food. He didn't know what to do with it. They're sending us food, his bridge officer said, quietly, like he was testing whether the words made sense. Yes, Skethra said, while we're disabled. Yes, a long pause. What does that mean, Commander? Skethra thought about the pattern he had recognized in the human formation. Clean, classical. Studied from the same sources every galactic military studied, and then refined into something quieter and more precise. He thought about the choice to target propulsion. Only propulsion, not weapons first, propulsion. The choice that said, we are not here to destroy you. We are here to make you stop moving. There was a whole philosophy in that targeting choice. A very specific philosophy that someone had made a conscious, deliberate decision to encode into military doctrine. He thought about the question. Why would they develop doctrine that wins battles without killing? He thought about that for a while. It means, he said slowly, that they planned this for a very long time. 3 systems away, the Selen Collective had watched the engagement from a distance, their ships sitting in observational formation. No weapons active, no movement. This was characteristic. The Collective was many things, but impulsive was not one of them. The 3 delegates aboard their primary vessel watched the sensor feed. They watched the Varric engagement from start to finish. They watched the human fleet disable 400 ships in 3 minutes with 0 casualties. They watched the repair ship being dispatched. They communicated with each other in the way they always communicated. Simultaneously, in the shared processing space that their biology provided. The conversation took 11 seconds. Then they opened a back-channel transmission to the human fleet command. The message was very short. We are prepared to negotiate immediately, at your convenience. The Collective had not always been a cooperative partner to humanity. They had imposed trade fees that amounted to extraction. They had blocked human access to several key transit lanes for decades. They had voted consistently to keep humanity categorized at levels that limited human influence in galactic affairs. They had also in 11 seconds of shared processing, concluded that all of those positions were no longer worth maintaining. The Selene Collective was not a species that confused past behavior with present circumstance. They were traitors. They understood when the terms had changed. The Human Fleet Command acknowledged the message. A human negotiating team would meet with collective representatives within 48 hours. The collective's delegates sent the acknowledgement to each other. 11 seconds of shared processing again. Then one of them sent a separate message to the others that translated, roughly, as, "We should have spoken with them differently years ago." The other two did not disagree. In the 6 hours it took for the repair ships to reach Skethra's fleet, he sat in his command chair and read everything his intelligence system had on Earth. He had read Earth's profile before. Everyone had. It was a brief document. Category primitive, single inhabitable world, 7 small colony stations of limited resource value, 1 diplomatic representative at the conclave, fleet capability rated as minimal. The profile was 20 pages. He read it in a new way now. He looked at what it said about Earth's fleet. The ships that had been catalogued, the ones Earth had shown to the galaxy. He compared them to what had just disabled his 400. The ships that were on record were not the ships that had just defeated him. They were not even in the same category. The ships on record were smaller, slower, differently armed, older looking, the kind of ships a primitive civilization would field. He thought about the 200 years of gravitational variance that had started appearing in the outer system readings that everyone had logged as calibration drift, because the idea that they were something else required an assumption that no one had been willing to make. He thought about what it took to build what had just defeated him, not just the ships, the secrecy, the capacity to keep the existence of something this large hidden for what must have been, given the ship generations on display, multiple human lifetimes, to show the galaxy one thing and build another, to field decoys and maintain them, and keep every person who knew the truth from speaking it, for longer than most galactic empires had been continuous. He thought about the word patience. In his own language, it was not a word the Varric used positively. Patience was what prey exercised, what the weak did while the strong decided their fate. He was revising that. The food arrived. Simple containers, human-made, standard nutrition packs. They were delivered by a small, unmanned vessel that docked with his ship's emergency port without being asked. The nutrition packs were calibrated for Varric biology. Someone had looked up the dietary requirements before sending them. He opened a container, ate slowly, looked at the wall of his damaged bridge. He thought about the voice on the speakers. "We ask only that you listen." He had 30 years in the military, 30 years of understanding power. He had built his career on the premise that power was force, that force was demonstrated by its application, that the measure of a military was what it could destroy. He was 48 hours from submitting his retirement papers. He didn't make the decision then, in that moment. He made it slowly, over the 6 hours it took for propulsion to be restored. He made it the way a structure shifts before it falls. Small movements, each one small, adding up to something irreversible. What he was certain of, sitting in his command chair eating human food in his crippled ship, was this: he had been in 30 wars, and not one of them had been won by the side that sent food to the people it defeated. He didn't know yet what that meant, but he was going to think about it. On the conclave station, Mara Voss was standing at the center podium of the main chamber. The chamber was full, every seat, species that had not attended a full session together in 2 years, because full sessions were rare, because emergencies were rare, because the galactic order was generally stable enough that emergencies did not often require everyone to be in the same room at the same time. They were in the same room now. She placed a folder on the lectern. Inside the folder was a single document, not the signed reclassification, a new one, printed that morning. She looked up at the chamber, 17 tears, all of them looking back at her. She thought, "I have been waiting 11 years to stand at this lectern." She thought, no, longer. Some of the people who built the fleets never got to stand here, never got to see this. She was standing here for them too. For Tobias Crane, who welded hull plating for 6 years and went home to his daughter and never said a word. For Constance Adeyemi, who taught her officers to ask what happens the day after and retired before she could see the answer. For the 380,000 people currently serving in 17 fleets, living compressed and secret lives, waiting for the word that it was done. She thought, "I will not waste this." "New terms," she said. Her voice was even. The chamber was quiet enough that she did not need to raise it. For everyone. She opened the folder. She began to speak. The negotiations lasted 11 days, not because they were difficult exactly. They were difficult in the way that all large things are difficult. Full of details, full of people who needed to be heard, full of moments where language failed to carry the precise weight of what was being said. But the fundamental structure of the negotiation was not difficult, because the fundamental structure was not actually a negotiation. It was, under the polite surface of the word, something else, something closer to. Here are the terms. Tell us which parts you need to discuss. This was not a criticism of the humans. It was simply the truth of overwhelming leverage, and the humans had the decency not to pretend otherwise. Mara Voss led the human delegation. She had 2 advisors, specialists in galactic trade law, people who had spent their careers inside the program, preparing for exactly these 11 days. She had Admiral Adeyemi available by secure communication from his flagship. She had in the background the fact of 41,000 ships. She did not mention the ships. She did not need to. Everyone in the room was already aware of them. They sat in people's awareness the way a large animal sits in a room. You don't have to look at it to know it's there. The first thing on the document was the simplest, the 3 colony worlds, Kepler 7 station, the Brennan habitats, the Mira agricultural ring. Mara placed the original reclassification document on the table, the one she had signed, the one she had kept in her folder for 3 weeks, carrying it to sessions and back to her office and back to sessions again. She pushed it across to the Varric representative. Not Vorik 10. He had been removed from his position 4 days into the crisis. This was a different Varric official, a woman named Sekmara, who had the look of a person who had received a sudden promotion under difficult circumstances and was conducting herself with professionalism. Despite it, Mara respected her for that. Void it, Mara said. Mara looked at the document, looked at Mara. The 3 systems, she said. You want them returned. We want them recognized as having always been ours, Mara said. The voiding of the document reflects that, not a return. An acknowledgement that the transfer was invalid. Sekmara looked at her advisors. They exchanged something in Varric, low, quick. Then she looked back at Mara. There is the matter of the infrastructure the Dominion has built in those systems during the oversight period, she said. The processing facilities on Mira. The transit, you can have the infrastructure, Mara said. We'll buy it from you. Fair market rate. Assessed by a Preth evaluator, which both parties will accept as binding. She paused. We're not interested in punishing the Dominion for what it built. We're interested in our people living on their own worlds without reporting to your administrators. Sekmara absorbed this. There was a pause that Mara recognized as the pause of someone calculating whether this was a trick. It wasn't a trick. Mara had spent 11 years watching what tricks looked like. She had become very good at not being one. Agreed, Sekmara said. That was the first afternoon. The 6 additional worlds came on day 3, and they required more conversation. These were systems the Varric had absorbed over the past 40 years, not human worlds, but inhabited worlds. Species classified at various low tiers of the galactic hierarchy. 2 worlds of the Cheth, a burrowing species the Dominion used for subsurface mining operations. A water world called Seren, whose people were small and fast, and had been building boats for 6,000 years when the Dominion arrived. 3 others. All of them now under Dominion administrative oversight, which was a clean phrase for something less clean. The Dominion had not expected these to be on the table. Sekmara looked at the relevant section of Mara's document for a long time. This concerns species that are not human, she said. Yes, Mara said. Your leverage in this negotiation derives from your military capacity, which you developed to address human interests. You are applying it to. We are applying it to the terms we consider fair, Mara said. You're right that no one asked us to. We're doing it anyway. She looked at the Varric representative with an expression that was not aggressive and not apologetic. An expression that simply occupied the space the argument would have needed. We have the capacity to care about more than ourselves. We decided to use it. The Preth scholar, the one who had been watching Mara for 11 years, the one with the face that made suggestions of expressions, was seated at the edge of the room as an observer. He was not a party to the negotiation. He had come every day regardless and seated himself in the same chair and watched with the attentiveness of something that was learning a lesson it had needed for a very long time. On day 3 in the break period, he found Mara at the refreshment station. The 6 worlds, he said. You gain nothing tactical from their release. No, she said. Then why include them? She poured water, drank some, set the glass down. Because we could, Shane said. And because there is a difference between could have helped and didn't. And didn't know and couldn't. We knew. We can, so. He was quiet for a moment. The session after this one, he said. The Preth Assembly would like to formalize a research exchange with Earth. We have data from 4,000 years of scientific observation. We would like to know what you have been learning, in the dark, for the past 2 centuries. Mara looked at him for a moment. She thought about what 4,000 years of Preth data represented. She thought about 200 years of human engineering, physics, material science, weapons development, propulsion research, All of it off-book, all of it unshared, all of it building on itself in secret. "We'll put it on the agenda," she said. He nodded, and did something she had not seen him do in 11 years of watching him from her low tier in the chamber. He inclined his head, not a bow. The Preth did not bow, something more deliberate than that. The specific acknowledgement that one ancient, certain thing gives to another thing it has newly found to be significant. The Selen Collective negotiations lasted 2 days and were the most technically complex part of the process. Trade law is always the most complex part. Mara's advisors handled the granular work. The broad strokes were settled in the first hour. All transit fees applied to human shipping were to be renegotiated from zero, on current market basis, with no legacy charges applied. The lanes that had been closed to human traffic for decades would open. A joint trading committee, with equal human representation, would be established to handle future disputes. One of the Selen delegates said, in the way the collective spoke when they were being as close to personal as they got. "We should have arrived at this arrangement some years ago." Mara said, "Yes, the collective delegate processed this. You are not going to tell us it's all right." "It's not all right," Mara said, "but it's done. We're talking about what happens next." She looked at the 3 faces, all of them angled toward her in their synchronized way. "What happens next is what matters to us." The collective processed this for 11 seconds. "We find this approach," one of them said, and then all 3 said together, "efficient." Mara thought it was probably the nicest thing the collective had ever said to a human. On day 7, Admiral Adeyemi flew in from his flagship. He had asked to be present for the Preth session, which was the one part of the negotiation conducted in private. He arrived at the station, walked through corridors where delegates and staff looked at him with the specific expression of people revising a long-held estimation. He was not an impressive-looking man, physically. Average height, gray at his temples, the slightly tired eyes of someone who had been running a command operation for 3 continuous weeks. His uniform was plain. He carried no visible insignia beyond his rank pins. The way he walked was the impressive thing, not military stiff, just very certain, in the quiet way of someone who has always known exactly where he stands and does not require the acknowledgement of anyone else to maintain it. He met with the 2 Preth scholars for 3 hours. The room was sealed, no recording. This had been the Preth Assembly's condition, and Adeyemi had accepted it without discussion. No one ever reported what was said in that room. Adeyemi came out looking, as Mara had noted in the outline, 10 years older. The Preth scholars came out looking thoughtful, which was, by all accounts from people who had worked with the Preth for decades, genuinely unusual. What Mara did know, because Adeyemi told her, later, in the brief debrief they held after the session, was that the Preth had asked one question primarily for 3 hours in many different forms. The question was, why? Not why build the fleet, not why wait. Why the specific choice to come without firing first, when you had the capacity to walk in and demand rather than request? Why the food sent to Skethra's disabled ships? Why the 6 worlds that were not human? Why design a military doctrine around the idea that what you do the day after matters more than what you do on the day? Adeyemi had told her his answer. "I told them it was because of my grandmother," he said. "Because she taught me that winning a war is easy and winning what comes after is hard. And the second one is what you'll live in for the rest of your life." And she learned it from 40 years of studying every galactic war in the historical record, and what she found was that every war that was won with maximum force created a grievance that lasted for generations. And every generation of grievance produced another war, and no one ever actually won. They just had the space between conflicts. He paused. "I told them we did not want to be in the space between conflicts. We wanted to get off that cycle entirely." Mara had asked what the Preth said to that. "They didn't say anything for about 4 minutes," Adeyemi said. "Then one of them asked whether I thought it would work. What did you say?" "I said I had no idea," he said. "I said we thought it was worth trying." The new galactic charter was completed on day 11. It was longer than the previous one. It covered trade. It covered colony status and sovereignty. It covered the minimum rights guaranteed to inhabited worlds regardless of their military or economic classification. It covered dispute resolution. It covered the new galactic council structure, which now included a human seat at the primary tier, equal in standing to the Varek Dominion and the Selen Collective and the Preth Assembly. 1 seat, at the same height as everyone else. 14 species signed it. The Varek Dominion signed last. Sekmara placed her seal on the document with the air of a person doing something they had decided to do cleanly rather than reluctantly, which Mara appreciated. She had not enjoyed the Dominion's behavior over 11 years, but she did not enjoy watching them diminished either. It was not about diminishment. It was about terms. The signing was not a ceremony. There was no event. The chamber was not decorated. They sat at the table one by one and signed, and that was all. On the day after the signing, Lieutenant Danny Reyes waited outside the main chamber. She was 23. She had been born on the Brennan Habitats. Born while the Habitats were under Varric oversight. Born to a mother who had worked 11 years in the resource processing operations the Dominion ran there. She was in the Fleet 12, 3rd Division, junior officer, the youngest rank that had been cleared for station presence during the negotiations. She had not been in the negotiating sessions. She had been in the corridor. For 11 days, she had watched delegates come and go. She had watched Mara Voss walk through the corridor every morning with her folder. She had watched Adeyemi arrive on day 7 and leave on day 9. She had watched the Preth scholar incline his head. She waited for Adeyemi outside the chamber after the signing. He came out with Mara and 2 advisors, all of them talking quietly, all of them with the texture of people who had just finished a very long run and were not yet sure how to hold their arms. Reyes stepped forward. Admiral. He looked at her. Took in the rank pins, Lieutenant. I'm Danny Reyes. I was born on the Brennan Habitats. Something moved across his face. Not quite expression. Recognition, maybe. Or the thing adjacent to it. The awareness of what a name like hers carried in this specific moment, in the corridor of this specific station, on this specific day. I know what you're going to ask me, he said. Sir. She kept her voice level. She had been practicing it for days. They took our worlds. They called us primitives. They made my mother work in their labor operations for 11 years. And we just... She paused. And the pause had edges. We just talked to them. Adeyemi did not answer fast. He looked at her for a long time. The way her grandmother had looked at junior officers who asked questions she thought mattered. Not evaluating, actually looking. Yes, he said. Because your mother is alive to hear about it. Reyes held this. She had known that was the answer. Some version of it. She had known it would be reasonable and correct in the way that answers to hard questions were sometimes reasonable and correct without being enough. She did not feel that it was enough. She felt that 11 years of her mother's life existed somewhere in the space between the question and the answer, and that no amount of signed charters moved those years. She did not say this. She nodded. Yes, sir. He held her gaze for a moment longer. He did not tell her she was wrong to feel what she felt. He did not re-explain. He just held the gaze, and in it was something she recognized, later, as the same thing the answer always carried when it was real. I know it's not enough. We're doing it anyway. He walked on. She stood in the corridor. She thought about her mother, about the habitats, about the soil on Mira, which she had read about in briefings but never seen. Rich soil, her briefing said. Ready for planting, ready to be theirs again, she thought. Alive to hear about it. She thought. It's not enough. She thought. But the habitats are ours. She did not reconcile these. She held them both. She was 23 years old and she was going to have to hold them both for a long time. And she had enough self-knowledge to suspect that the holding of both was what the next part of her life was going to be built from. She went back to her post. Mara Voss spent the evening alone in her office. She had that morning been offered a larger office. A human delegation now had rooms on the primary floor. Actual rooms, with windows facing the atrium. She had declined for now. She would move eventually. But not tonight. She sat at her small desk, the small window, the gray view. On the shelf above her desk was the glass she always rinsed and replaced there. She had done it 11 years in a row. She was going to do it tonight, and then when she moved offices, she would take the glass. She opened her desk drawer. Inside, where she had placed it on the night of the session 3 weeks ago, was the original reclassification document, not the copy she had used in the negotiation. That one had been voided and filed in the conclave record. This was her copy, the one she had signed with a pen while Vorik-Tan's aide made a sound of quiet amusement. She took it out. She unfolded it. She read it once. The whole thing. The formal language, the administrative category. Earth, Protected Primitive World, Category 3. The date, her signature, in her own handwriting, even in small. She thought about Tobias Crane. She didn't know his name. She didn't know most of their names. But she knew they had existed. 200 years of them. Living compressed and silent and building in the dark. And she thought about them anyway, the unnamed shape of them. The specific quality of a life lived in service of something you will not see completed. She thought about Constance Adeyemi. She thought about Yusuf Adeyemi III, who had walked out of a 3-hour meeting with the oldest species in the known galaxy looking 10 years older, and told her, calmly, that he had said he had no idea if it would work and thought it was worth trying. She thought about Danny Reyes in the corridor. She thought about her mother, living and alive on the Brennan Habitats. She folded the reclassification document. She held it for a moment. She put it back in the drawer and closed the drawer and left it there. Her comm chimed. The new Galactic Charter. Officially filed. Officially ratified. Officially the current law of the known galaxy. Was available for her personal record. A notification from the Conclave Registry System. Plain and administrative, the kind of message the registry sent for every document filed. She looked at the notification. She picked up her pen. She thought, someone told them we were a footnote. She thought, footnotes are written by people who have already decided what the story is. She accepted the notification. The window was gray. The stars were somewhere behind it, as they always were, present, indifferent, enormously old, in every direction, in systems that now appeared on charts under different labels than they had 3 weeks ago. Things were adjusting. Governments were filing reports. Fleet commanders were writing analyses. Species that had never thought much about Earth were thinking about Earth. The galaxy was doing what large things do when a piece of their understanding turns out to be wrong. Slowly, noisily, grumpily, it was updating. It would take time. It was going to take a lot of time. Most things worth doing took a very long time. Mara turned off the lamp. Outside, the atrium was lit, and the station turned in space, and the stars that the Varric senator had called Earth's context were there. All of them, the same stars they had always been. The ones that Tobias Crane's daughter grew up looking at. The ones that Admiral Constance Adeyemi had watched from the bridge of a fleet that didn't officially exist. The ones that a 23-year-old girl on the Brennan Habitats had pressed her face to a porthole to see when she was small, wondering what was out there. The galaxy, it turned out, had misread the footnote. The footnote had always been the whole story. They just hadn't bothered to read it yet.